Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Black Circle Stories, Volume 1, Story 1. Captain John M. Harper, owner and master of the steamer Wilmington, which made daily sailings from Wilmington to Southport over half a century ago, was one of Wilmington's most familiar figures and best beloved residents. In the days before automobiles and before rail connections between the two ports, he and his steamer were important features of the lower Cape Fear section. The trip between Wilmington and Southport took about 2 hours each way, and the Wilmington made charter or excursion sailings as well as regularly scheduled runs. It was said the visitors from the interior had not really seen the lower Cape Fear until they made a voyage with Captain Harper. Local outing parties and groups visiting the coast country, particularly parents with restless children, enjoyed a sail with Captain Harper because of his ability as an entertainer as well as for the trip itself. The captain was a truly gifted storyteller, and the yarns he would spin were a feature of any voyage with him. The story of the colonial apparition was one of his favorites. Among others, he told the story to Dr. James Sprunt of Wilmington, historian of the Lower Cape Fear, and Dr. Sprunt included in an address before a meeting of the North Carolina Society of Colonial Dames in the late 1890s, which gave it an early recording. This is the story, reconstructed from Captain Harper's own accounts of its origin and from his many retellings. Many years ago, on a winter night, a terrific storm was raging on the lower Cape Fear. Captain Harper was sailing the steamer Wilmington slowly down the river on one of his regular runs from Wilmington to Southport. The night was inky black and it was sleeting hard. The ice-laden wind, together with the intense darkness, made navigation difficult, and it was more by instinct than by sight that Captain Harper was sailing his staunch craft on a familiar course. There was only one passenger aboard, a stranger to Captain Harper. He had given his name as Macmillan. As the Wilmington made its way slowly along in the blinding storm, the lone passenger, seeking warmth and company in the pilot house with Captain Harper, made conversation. He asked the sturdy old captain if he had ever heard the story of the execution of the Scottish Highlanders at nearby Brunswick during the American Revolution. Captain Harper, his eyes peering into the night outside the glass-enclosed compartment, replied that he had not, and asked for details. Macmillan, the passenger, said that his own great-grandfather, William Macmillan of Edinburgh, Scotland, had been involved in the incident. This ancestor had enlisted in the Cameronians in 1745, and after the Battle of Culloden, had come to North Carolina at the invitation of Governor Gabriel Johnston, whom he knew personally, and had made his home among the Scotsmen who had already settled in the Cape Fear region. In the course of time, he became a Whig, like many of his associates. During the Revolution, he heard much of the daring exploits of the Tory leader, Colonel David Fanning, who apparently had a remarkable facility for securing accurate information about everyone in the range of his operations. His methods seem to have been to go after and capture special individuals, with an eye to the intelligence he could pick up, and he was known for his sudden attacks and his relentless cruelty. In the closing days of the Revolution in September 1781, Fanning surprised the town of Hillsborough, captured Governor Burke and other prominent townspeople, and marched them off to Wilmington, then in the hands of the British. On the way to Wilmington, Fanning also managed to pick up William Macmillan with two other Highland Whigs who had already been marked as doomed men because of their so-called treason and violating an oath, reluctantly given, which bound them to a hostile sovereign. After delivering Governor Burke and his party to Major Craig, British commandant in Wilmington, Fanning marched his other prisoners to the port town of Brunswick on the Cape Fear River between Wilmington and Southport. Here the three Whigs, including William Macmillan, were imprisoned in the loathsome hull of an old prison ship anchored far out in the bay. After a short confinement during which the unfortunate men made fruitless efforts to escape, They were brought ashore, given a trial that was a mockery of justice, and sentenced by Fanning to immediate execution. They had only a few moments to prepare for death. The place chosen for their execution was a spot near the ruins of Governor Tryon's palace at Russellborough, between the town of Brunswick and King Roger Moore's house at Orton. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the two condemned Whigs were let out. With no sign of fear, they faced a firing squad. At a command, they were riddled with bullets and fell dead. Macmillan was then let out. While standing unbound for a fleeting moment beside a tree where he was to be bound again, he made a sudden dash for liberty. He gained the protection of some tangled underbrush, dived quickly into the adjoining woods, and managed to elude his captors in the thick forest without so much as a wound from the muskets fired after him. Driving himself desperately ahead, Macmillan covered the distance of 70 miles to his home in Robeson County by daylight of the following morning, and there he lived to survive the troubles of the time and to die a natural death in 1800. As Captain Harper's lone passenger finished his story, the steamer Wilmington was just passing near the general vicinity of Brunswick, the site of the double Whig execution long ago, and the escape of William Macmillan. In the pilot house, the captain and his passenger listened in silence for a moment to the raging sleet and howling wind of the winter storm. Then the passenger recalled a superstition he had heard about that very spot. The natives in the area believed that on stormy nights the ghosts of two murdered men sometimes walked there. He asked Captain Harper if he, in the richness of his river lore, had ever heard such a story. The captain had, he said, heard vague reports of the presence of such apparitions during storms. Macmillan then expressed the view that these ghosts were the spirit of the two Whigs who had been executed by a firing squad. He had made certain quiet investigations and had learned that the twin ghosts had been seen rowing a phantom boat on the waters of the Brunswick port. His own theory was that the ghosts of the two executed Scots were searching for a vessel bound for Scottish shores. Captain Harper was intensely interested, and his curiosity was aroused by the report and the deduction of his passenger. Outside, the wind moaned low and long, and the sleet rattled against the pilot house windows. Midnight approached. Captain Harper said in later years that this night constituted one of the most terrifying experiences of his entire life on the Cape Fear. He was constantly in fear that his ship would founder in the storm. The deck watch outside was taking constant soundings, and as the wind rose to hurricane proportions, Peter Jorgensen, the mate, rushed in with word that they had lost their channel and were apparently drifting towards some jetties. Almost in the same instant, the Wilmington's keel passed over the jetties and the craft was caught fast, a prisoner of the river in a terrific storm. Taking stock of the situation, Captain Harper told a small crew and his one passenger that the vessel was apparently little damaged. He instructed them all to make themselves as comfortable as possible, for they would have to await the turning of the tide and abatement in the storm. The crew sought the warmth and comfort of the furnace room, all save Peter Jorgensen, who was left deckside on guard, and he continued to walk the upper deck despite the cruel punishment of the frigid weather and flying ice. Suddenly Jorgensen's thoughts were interrupted by an icy blast of additional fury, and then, through the murky midnight, in the wildest winter storm the river had ever seen, Jorgensen saw just ahead the standing figure of a man, clad in unkempt, dripping clothes, hair and beard encrusted with ice, and a face contorted as if from a great agony of fear. The apparition's right hand appeared to grasp the ship's rail, while the left hand pointed back into the storm. Jorgensen, controlling his own terror as best he could, reached to seize hold of the stranger, but his hand fell in empty air. The apparition was gone. Jorgensen hurried to the pilot house and reported to Captain Harper what had happened. The captain accused the mate of being drunk, but Jorgensen, frightened and trembling, insisted that he had seen a ghost. The captain and Macmillan decided that they would look about. Jorgensen begged excuse from the expedition, saying that he would not look at that awful face again if they gave him the ship. The men bundled up, searched the deck, found nothing, and returned to the warmth of the pilot house. Jorgensen, waiting there, stuck to his story, as indeed he did for the rest of his life. He said that even in the storm, the rays of dim light from his lantern fell full on the face of the apparition. Within an hour, the rising tide and the driving motion of the ship's propellers moved the ship from its dangerous position on the jetties, and the trip was resumed. No sooner was the Wilmington underway again than a night-flying gull, first attracted by the lights of the ship and then blinded by them, crashed through a glass window of the pilot house and fell quivering and bleeding at the feet of the Scottish passenger. Icy air filled the pilot's compartment. Macmillan insisted that it was a bad omen and that trouble was ahead. But Captain Harper was a jocular about the whole thing, or tried to be, and to offset the mate's fears and the passengers' warnings, he suggested that they would have other nocturnal visitors. "Keep a sharp lookout for another ghost," the captain said. "Just across the water to our left we are passing the plantation Lilliput, which was owned by old Admiral Franklin of the Royal Navy. The Admiral may also be cruising with the ghost tonight." Gradually the conversation settled down to the unusual weather, and Captain Harper gave his major attention to steering the Wilmington. Then the windy night was suddenly pierced with a human cry from the direction of the farther shore. This time the captain was startled, as he admitted 10 years later. By now everyone on the ship, except the captain, was confused and frightened amid the incessant shrieking of the wind, the roar of the waves, and the inky darkness all about. Jorgensen said he heard a siren's whistle. The captain said it was imagination, but to calm the confusion he signaled for a full stop. The steamer sank into a hollow trough and started to roll. There were now no engine noises to compete with the howl of the wind. Suddenly, down the roaring wind, there came an awful, agonizing scream. Captain Harper ordered sailors on special watches all around the deck, took more soundings, and decided that he was almost opposite the spot where the old slave ship had been anchored and the story his passenger had just been telling him. He gazed through the storm and the night toward the old colonial anchorage, and then from that very direction by the compass the scream came again, a terrible and frightening noise, but unmistakably of human origin. And then some object began to shape up in the night, looking like a boat and yet surrounded by a sort of phosphorescent glow. Gradually the two vessels drew closer together, and I, straining into the darkness, saw just off the rail of the Wilmington an ancient rowing barge, so foul with slimy seaweed that it might have been afloat 100 years or more. The men on the Wilmington, captain, crew, and passengers, rubbed their eyes and looked again. Meantime, the weird and awful cries continued. Captain Harper ordered his crew to stand by and throw the barge a line, and as they moved to obey, a now thoroughly frightened crew seemed to behold two gaunt figures in tattered Highland dress. Their emaciated legs were held in heavy chains which extended to scarred and bloody wrists. As far as the attached chains would permit, the figures raised their hands in silent supplication. Captain Harper could think only of the story he had just heard. Everybody on the steamer was awestricken, until the captain found his voice and repeated the order that the line be heaved to the two men. Peter Jorgensen had started to throw the line when an extra-large wave caught the ship, but he heaved just the same, and as he did, the giant wave swallowed up the rotting hulk. With its gruesome and voiceless crew, it completely disappeared. Only the rolling, tossing river remained, with no trace of the barge that had plainly been there just a moment before. Captain Harper ordered his engine started, and the ship resumed its course. Hardly 10 minutes had passed before a member of the crew on watch shouted that they were running upon a wreck. The course was quickly changed, and the Wilmington barely avoided a collision with a huge mass that proved to be a vessel lying bottom up. To this wreckage clung two men, half dead from exposure and cold. The men were soon rescued and brought aboard the steamer. As the lanterns fell full on their face, Peter Jorgensen shouted excitedly that one was the man who had come out of the night and grasped the rail of the steamer. While the rescued men were receiving aid and attention, they told their story. Their ship had been overturned in the river during the storm. 5 members of the crew were washed overboard and drowned. The remaining 2 managed to cling to the hulk. Although they grew weaker by the hour, they continued to shout in the hope of attracting a rescuer. To his death, Captain Harper told the story with gusto. He never offered, but merely suggested a satisfactory explanation for the strange appearance of the colonial apparition on that never-to-be-forgotten night. He left it to his always ready listeners to decide between the freakish behavior of a storm and the answer most of them preferred: ghosts. Next story. Buried alive. The very term brings a chill that grips the spine. Many people have had a secret dread that it might happen to them, and it actually has happened to a few. One of these rare instances is dealt with here because a ghost is also involved. Wilmington in 1810 is the setting for this chiller diller. A young man named Samuel R. Jocelyn lived in Wilmington at the time. He stood well in the community, was clean of habit, and had a fine character. His father was a well-known attorney who had also been reared in Wilmington and, like his son, enjoyed a fine reputation. Young Jocelyn had a friend, Alexander Hostler. According to a record of this ghostly episode written more than a century ago, the two were inseparable. Their Damon and Pythias relationship knew no interruption or misunderstanding. There were no recognized breaches or interferences in it. Where one went, the other usually went too. They shared their thoughts, their ideals, their aspirations. At work and play and study and sports and entertainment, they were almost always to be found side by side. These young friends became interested in metaphysics. Beginning with a study of philosophy and then turning to the psychology of that day, they began delving deep into mental and spiritual realms. They shared their findings as well as their enthusiasm with their associates, who found them always ready to discuss the special interest. One summer day in 1810, in conversation with a group of friends, their talk turned to the possibility of a person's returning to Earth after death, in some form or other, and making his presence known. Most of the group ridiculed such a possibility. However, the two young friends argued that it might happen, and while not especially championing the theory, stoutly defended its possibility, even though their companions made fun of them. They maintained that there must be some way for a departed spirit to return and actually indicate what was happening to him in the other world. The conversation ended with a positive agreement between Jocelyn and Hostler that the first of the two to die would certainly reveal himself to the one who survived. The others in the group laughed and took the whole thing lightly. But later developments recalled that particular occasion and that specific conversation most vividly to the minds of all who had been there. Jocelyn was a great lover of horses. He liked riding over the bridle paths of the beautiful forest around Wilmington. Hostler, less interested, sometimes failed to follow along on these occasions. It was the one common interest in which they differed in the extent of their participation. One afternoon, Jocelyn set out alone for a ride. A few hours later, he was found in the road unconscious. He lay beneath an oak in a forest of centenarian trees clustered together in massive beauty. His horse was grazing a few yards away, alongside a stretch of sandy road. Two men in a cart, passerbys, picked up Jocelyn and carried him home. Everything known to the medical science of that day was done to bring the young man back to consciousness, but all attempts were fruitless and he was finally pronounced dead. 2 days later, he was buried in the St. James Church burial ground in the heart of the city of Wilmington, a cemetery that has been in use for more than 200 years. Appropriate services were held with many friends and relatives present. Hostler was greatly affected by the sudden death of his close friend. He refused to be comforted. 2 nights after the funeral, according to the recorded story, Hostler was in the room that he and Jocelyn had often occupied together. His thoughts were entirely taken up with the associations of the familiar room and its acute grief for the friend he had lost. And sitting there under the deep shadow of his loneliness, Hostler was suddenly overwhelmed completely by the appearance of Jocelyn himself, who said, "How could you let me be buried when I was not yet dead?" "Not dead?" the horrified Hostler exclaimed. "No, I was not. Open the coffin and you will see that I am not lying in the position in which you placed me." And then the ghost-like figure of Jocelyn was gone. Hostler was astounded by the vividness of the appearance of his friend, even though he had believed that the dead might somehow manage to reappear and convey impressions to the living. He could not convince himself that what had happened was a reality. He wondered if he had not been overcome by the intentness of his own thoughts. He finally came to the conclusion that it was all a trick of the imagination. Feeling sure that no one would believe what had happened, he decided to say nothing about it. But the following night, When he was again in his room thinking about his friend Jocelyn, the apparition appeared with the same inquiry, only this time the tone was more insistent. How could you let me be buried when I was not yet dead? Hostler's wonder was even greater than on the night before, but he again convinced himself that he was the victim of his own imagination. He now decided that such a thing was not within the realm of possibility, and he concluded once more to say nothing about it, lest he be considered a fool. But the third successive night brought the same occurrence, and this time the query was even more positive, more pleading. How could you let me be buried when I was not yet dead? The voice of Jocelyn implored Hostler to make an investigation. Hostler was no longer able to convince himself that it was the working of a fevered imagination. He decided that he must take action. He was completely bewildered by the strange visits and the phantom words of his dead friend on 3 successive nights. Would those to whom he might turn for help give proper attention to his story, or would they think his mind was giving way under the grief that had so overcome him? But he carried out his resolution, and the next morning he told the most unbelievable circumstances to a friend, Louis Toomer, a prominent Wilmingtonian of that day. In Toomer, Hostler found a friend who was sympathetic to the point of feeling that some investigation should be made. The two went to call on the parents of Jocelyn and recited to them the happenings of the past 3 nights. The grieving parents listened to the story of the strange visitations and offered no objection to the suggestion that the body be disinterred. They asked only that the exhumation be carried out as privately as possible, in order that no opportunity be afforded for curious persons to know what was being done. The wishes of the parents were of course respected by Hostler and Toomer, who were in thorough agreement. They therefore decided to disinter the body at night. So at midnight following the third visitation of the apparition, Hostler and Toomer went to the St. James churchyard, armed with shovels to move the loosely packed earth and implements to open the coffin. After a brief period of toil, the coffin appeared under the flicker of lanterns. When it was completely uncovered, the two men removed the casket lid. This done, they lowered a lantern closer. The body of Jocelyn was lying face down. There was further evidence of brief but frantic struggles in the close confines of the coffin, struggles that had actually loosened one side of the coffin. Hostler and Toomer faced the awful truth. Their friend had indeed been buried alive. Death, real and final death, in the form of suffocation, must have come quickly to the frantic young man. The assumption is that the fall from the horse brought on a state of catalepsy, with suspension of animation and accompanying muscular rigidity. This continued comatose state, with every appearance of death, convinced everyone that the youth was indeed dead. Colonel James G. Burr, beloved resident of Wilmington, told this story in a public lecture delivered at the Old Wilmington Opera House on February 3, 1890. The colonel said that the facts came from Hostler himself, who had related them to the colonel's mother, a near relative of Hostler. Louis Toomer, who assisted with the exhumation of the body, told of the disinterment in the presence of a venerable Wilmington woman, Mrs. Catherine G. Kennedy, who put a statement in writing for Colonel Burr. The colonel read Mrs. Kennedy's paper during the course of his lecture. Mrs. Kennedy was known for her many good works in Wilmington and was highly respected. The Catherine Kennedy Home, a refuge for aged women, was named for her. No one has evidence to bear on that phase of the story concerning the strange visitation of Samuel Jocelyn to his friend Alexander Hostler. It is one of those unexplainable things: a voice from the grave, spirit world communication, mental telepathy, fulfillment of a vision, something too supernatural to be pinned down. You may take your choice. It suffices for this story that Alexander Hostler was so certain he had held a ghostly conversation with a dead friend that he made an investigation, which resulted in the discovery of positive proof that Samuel Jocelyn was buried alive. Next story. Ghosts have always had a close affinity with gold. They're frequently found associating with legendary wealth, missing fortunes, hidden treasure. The more hopelessly lost the riches, the more likelihood of a first-class ghost. Few ghosts actually point a finger to these bonanzas or deliver them into deserving or undeserving hands. More often they are found in the role of protectors of lost loot. Such a ghostly protector still guards a cache of gold near Grandfather Mountain, although the ghost is on record as having once placed it within the grasp of a tippling hillbilly and his easygoing wife. Dave Kinder is the man who let the fortune stray just beyond the reach of his fingers, because, as he put it, he was more interested in life than in gold. This particular ghost took up his habitat at a sawmill in a valley beside a stream that looked up at venerable Grandfather Mountain not far away. The turbulent mountain stream had been halted momentarily there in the valley by a short and shallow dam. The cold water, accumulating rapidly in a deep, dark pool behind the dam, was in turn released, gradually to drive the winding blades that converted trees from the mountainside into fresh-smelling lumber. The ghost who assigned himself to haunt the sawmill was the ghost of a stranger, not that of a native son. This stranger came to the valley one day, traveling by foot, and headed north. Nobody knew him. Nobody knew anything about him. Nobody had ever seen him before. He had with him a canvas bag filled with something heavy, so heavy that it was difficult for him to carry. Of course, there was a suggestion that it was gold. The stranger spent a night at the mill, and because he was never seen again after sunset that night, and was never known to take his departure the following morning, it was bandied about the countryside that he had been killed during the night, killed for the heavy bag of gold he carried, and that his body had been weighed down and hidden in the cold pond beside the mill. From then on, people began to hear blood-curdling sounds and shiverings when they passed the mill on nights when there was no moon. Those making reports said the ghost rose from the chill mountain water, shook terribly, and went about his job of ghosting and haunting. One night Dave Kinder took him an extra slug of corn liquor and said he wasn't afraid of that mill ghost, and announced that he was going down to the mill just to see what the hell a ghost is like anyhow. He took a lantern with him and some sulfur matches, a new-fangled fire-making contraption of the day, but he didn't plan to strike a light until he heard something to make it worthwhile. Sure enough, that shivering noise they had all been hearing struck up after a while. Although Dave Kinder was waiting for it, the sound made his hair rise up along his neck and stand up straight on his head. Dave said in later years that it was the awfulest noise he had ever heard, that he was close enough to it really to hear how terrible it was. He said he couldn't understand why he had ever decided to go there in the first place, and wished he had brought his corn jug along for the double purpose of comfort and fortification. Then he said there was some kind of rattling noise all around his feet. That scared him more than ever, but it only took a few seconds to place that noise, a new noise to him. It was the sulfur matches falling from his hand one by one. He would smile when he told that part of the story. He finally recovered one of the matches, struck a light, got the lantern lit after several false tries, and then, he almost died, he said to himself. The shivering noise had stopped. Something was coming, something coming directly toward him. He could hear the slow, measured footsteps, and they were getting nearer and nearer. When the footfalls finally stopped, they were so close they were almost beside him. Dave finally unfroze his neck, mustered strength to open his eyes, and peered in the direction of the steps. And there, he said, stood the dripping remains. It was the remains of the drowned man, a terrible sight indeed. Where eyes had been, great sunken holes stared at Dave Kinder. The flesh was all fallen away from the face. There was no mouth, just teeth. Dave gave some pretty graphic and some pretty awful descriptions of what he saw. He pictured indeed a corpse raised from the bottom of the river after many months to walk about at night. Dave said that he finally found a voice and asked, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you?" Dave said there was no answer, but that the apparition beckoned for him to follow, and walked off into the brush on the side of the wall. There the awful thing pointed to a spot on the ground among some vines and low underbrush. Dave took one long look at the spot, found his running feet at the end of two tottering legs, and moved himself away from there as fast as he could go. He burst into his home, panting for breath, and said to his wife, "I'm drunk. I couldn't hold my liquor tonight. I got the chills and shakes, and I want to lie down." As he was getting into bed, Dave told his wife what had happened. Mrs. Kinder was delighted. "You're not drunk," she said. "You've just stumbled into a fortune." She added that she bet whoever killed that stranger got scared off, buried the heavy load of money because he couldn't get away with it, and for some reason was never able to come back and get it. She added, The ghost was trying to tell you where the money is buried. You go to sleep, get a good rest, and in the morning, when it's light, I'll help you dig at that spot the ghost showed you. The next morning, early, they went to the mill together, and sure enough, Dave could locate the very spot that the ghost had pointed out. He remembered the particular formation of honeysuckle vines. Dave began to feel that maybe he hadn't been drunk after all, that maybe his wife was right about this. He struck his mattock into the earth with a lusty blow while his wife looked on. But as he whammed into the matted vines and weeds and began to turn up the dark earth, the whole ground there about started to tremble violently. Dave and his wife were so scared that they both ran for dear life, and both were satisfied not to return for a second try. Dave said that in the months that followed, whenever he'd ride by the mill, something seemed to try to pull him off his horse and up toward the spot in the honeysuckle vines. But in terror he'd always lash his horse and ride clear of the space. Dave said he'd like to have the money all right, but not that bad. He wanted to live worse than he wanted gold. His wife agreed. They never did get the bag of gold because they never put foot on that particular spot. Next story. From North Carolina's rich background of story material comes this account of a haunted mill in Henderson County. Sadie Patton of Hendersonville, a well-informed, devoted student of Western North Carolina folklore and a widely known storyteller, uncovered it while pursuing her hobby. The story tells of an ancient grist mill far back in the days when there were more Indians than white men in the North Carolina mountain country. In the granite expanses around Jump-Off Rock in Henderson County, large bowl-like depressions still remain, as a reminder of the rude stone mortars where the patient squaws of a nearby Indian tribe performed their endless task of grinding corn for many years before the white man built his first grist mill in the region. The Indians were amazed when the white settlers moving into the mountain wilds brought with them easier and speedier ways of grinding corn. The water wheel on a tumbling stream was a wonder indeed, as it turned heavy stones to grind, in a few hours sufficient meal to feed an entire town. Such a mill, known as a Jones Mill, was established on the Old Willow Trail, or Indian Trail, a trading path of the Cherokees near Jump-Off Rock, and the grinding hollows worn in the granite. What the Indians thought of this invasion of their mountain home and the presence of the white man's water wheel near their ancient trading path has not been recorded. The mill seems to have served its purpose for a time. Then it was abandoned and fell into such decay that eventually even its location was difficult to find. Jack Houston certainly found this to be true. He had already spent 3 weeks searching along the headwaters of Willow Creek for the site of the old Jones Mill. He was surveying a large tract of land and needed to locate the mill's original corners and markers. Many of the early state grants of land in western North Carolina, particularly in the area west of the Blue Ridge, referred to old landmarks long since completely erased, and to Indian trails that soon either ceased to exist or shifted in place and direction. So Jack Houston was having a pretty difficult time with his surveying job. Nearly all the old settlers of the region were gone. Most of the line trees had been cut. It was spring and the sun was warm, but strips of snow lingered in the coves and along north banks. Robins were hopping about, and down on the creek bank a cardinal flashed in and out among the trees in streaks of brilliance. The surveying party halted for a rest in the damp lowlands along Willow Creek. They had not been able to find a trace of rotting timbers, a crumbling water wheel, or even a sign of where a mill race had carried water along at man's bidding. Any and all evidence of the old grist mill seemed to have vanished completely. Now Venerable Henry Hampton was a member of the surveying party, and Henry had a vast and almost uncanny knowledge of land markings. That was why surveyors so often used his services. He had spent all his life in the community and was said to know every foot of ground for miles around. Henry had shown the surveyors traces of the Indian path along the French Broad River, had told where it crossed Echo Mountain, passed Indian Cave, and came by Jump-Off Rock, where the hollowed-out grinding places still showed. On the spur of land that lay between Crabtree Creek and Willow Creek, he had pointed out places where Bob Black's boys, while plowing, had turned up Indian pipes, arrowheads, and broken pieces of earthen pots. At Bowman's Bluff, there was no lack of evidence that Cherokee hunters had roamed old trails there. But when it came to locating the place of the old mill on the Jones land, Henry Hampton had offered no suggestions, while the search for markings went on and on. The crew stood around in a huddle. Nobody had anything to say. Houston had about decided he would have to give up the hunt. Then Henry picked up a shovel and strode over to what appeared to be an old ditch. Pushing aside drooping branches of dog hobble, he began throwing out wet black dirt until the watcher saw that he had struck a solid object. He turned to the surveyor and made this startling announcement. "There's your old mill site on the Indian trail." It didn't take long after he pointed out the spot he had uncovered for the men to check out their notes and find that the distance they had followed ran out exactly at that place. The long survey was ended. All that afternoon, while Houston worked over his papers and made preparations for leaving the valley next morning, he kept thinking about Henry Hampton and wondering why the old man had waited so long to point out the corner, when it was apparent that he had known its exact location all the time. Henry became brooding in about dark and watched the surveyor finish his packing. As he watched, he spoke. "Maybe you've been wondering why I didn't show you that corner sooner," he said. "But things have happened about that place that men just don't talk about. Now you're leaving. I'll tell you why I'll never forget that old mill." And this statement, made with some difficulty, opened the floodgates for Henry's story. He said that folks in that area had regarded the old mill site up there alongside the Indian path as a haunted mill. Then he told his own experience. As a young man, he was courting a girl on Crabtree Creek and was about to marry her. One night he was walking in bright moonlight along the Jones Road at the Gap. From that point, he could see down into the Willow Creek Valley, and he started thinking about the mill site on Willow Creek. A mill was standing there then, although it had been abandoned. He thought the mill might fit into his plans to marry the girl over on Crabtree Creek. He told himself it would be a good chance for a young man to go there and reopen the mill. He could tend farm and then run the mill in slack seasons, grinding for his neighbors. There was no other mill nearby. By the time he came to the forks of the road, he was so interested in the plan and its possibilities that he decided to go and look the place over, even if it was well past midnight. The full moon was high in the sky, and it seemed almost as light as day. He knew well enough the story of how Robert Jones had come there after the Revolutionary War. Jones had grants for 2,000 or 3,000 acres of land, some of it having been given to him for service in the army, and he had bought up more land too. It could be had then at a few cents an acre. The Cherokees had a trading path through the area, and Jones' papers called for the Willow Trail as a boundary line, the same line that Jack Houston had so much trouble locating. While Jones settled down, put a log dam on Willow Creek, and built his first mill there. The mill was located near the hollowed-out places in stone where the Indian women had been pounding their corn for years and years. Jones quickly progressed from a corn to a corn cracker type of mill or pound mill. Jones was smart. He devised a way of putting corn in a hopper at night and leaving the ponderous water wheel going at a slow splish-splash all night long to find his meal ground and ready in the morning. And he was a hard worker. His farm was soon cleared, stables were built, and he put an L on his log cabin, a mark of affluence indeed. By that time Jones had decided to build a real grist mill, so that he could take on the grinding of grain for the entire neighborhood, if they wanted it. There was no millwright around in those days, so he went to Charleston, where his first wife's people kept a store, and had them order mill rocks to be sent over from England. Back home, and waiting for delivery of the stones, he built the mill race and water wheel. Finally, a ship brought the stones to Charleston, and his brother-in-law hauled them by covered wagon to what is now Henderson County. They were put in place, and the first grist mill to do custom grinding in that valley started operation. Some months after the mill opened, Jones worked late and was slow in coming home to supper. When dark was closing in, Mrs. Jones sent one of the older children to see what was keeping his father. The boy soon came rushing back to report that his father was lying on his face on the ground near the mill. When the neighbors got there, they found him with an arrow buried to the haft between his shoulders. Some of the roving Indians had been giving trouble, and all evidence was that one of them had shot Jones from ambush as he sat on the hitching block. After that, Through the years that followed, all sorts of tales were told about the Jones Mill there on Willow Creek. Sounds of the mill grinding away in the middle of the night were reported. White shadowy figures were seen there. It finally got so that no one would go there, and after a year or so the Jones widow moved away. When the Jones boy were grown, they came back and made plans to live there, but by that time the mill and water wheel were falling apart, and dividing the land between the sons of the leaky old mill race was agreed on as a boundary line. One corner was fixed where the old hopper base used to be. Ralph Jones built a house on the upland side of his tract. People in the section were beginning now to raise wheat, so Ralph put up another mill, one equipped to make flour as well as meal. Folks around the settlement were glad to have this new or rebuilt mill, and it ran busy for 3 or 4 years. Ralph and his wife had no children and lived alone. One night some boys out possum hunting saw a big fire against the sky. When they reached it, they found the Ralph Jones home settling down into ashes. After the embers cooled, they found enough to know that Ralph and his wife had been burned to death. Henry Hampton said he had heard all these stories as a boy, and he recalled them on the night when he went down into the Willow Creek Valley to look over the closed mill. The door to the mill was not fastened. The moon was bright enough for him to see everything, so he went on in. The hopper had some grain in it. There was meal in the bin. He stuck his hand in and felt it. Flour was still white on the bolting cloth. The toddick was sitting right where it had been down the last time it was measured. It was hard to believe that a miller had not been working there the day before. Henry said he was pretty well satisfied about this location, and his new plans were just the thing for him and his bride. They could build a little shack, move there, and run the place. Henry said he felt almost as if he already owned the mill as he pulled the door shut and started for home. He turned back for one more look after he got out in the open. As he did so, he saw an old lady coming out of the trail that led up the head of the old mill race, the very place where the surveying party had been that afternoon. She was wrapped in a shawl. Henry said he thought it was some woman from the neighborhood who had been out sitting with a sick person. As he went ahead toward home, the woman followed at a distance. But soon he said he realized that he heard no footsteps. Looking back, he saw the shadowy figure was following along, keeping just about the same distance away. Henry quickened his pace after that, and finally, when he came to the point where his father's sled road made a sharp turn downhill, he was going at a good dog trot. Then he realized that the person following him was keeping well apace and was also turning in on their roadway. Henry started running then at full speed, with a chilling fear driving his feet faster and faster. He didn't stop until he was in the house and the bar on the door had dropped into place. Then he tiptoed over and looked out the window. A figure stood there in the shadow of the trees down by the gate. Whatever it was and whoever it was had arms folded across the breast. Closer study from behind the window convinced Henry that it was not a woman in a shawl, as he had thought, but a man wrapped in what looked like a blanket. Well, Henry told Jack Houston he didn't do anything about trading for the mill after that night, and the mill stood vacant and kept on going down. The road routed out deeper and deeper during rainy seasons. Bushes grew up in the mill race. Henry concluded his recital. I don't suppose anybody has been in there for 40 years until we went today looking for the old corner at that line that calls for the Indian path on Willow Creek.